Hi, Shepherd of the Lake Lutheran Church. My name is Ed, and I am an addict. I don't know if you know this or not, but I am actually a member of this church through my wife, Karen, who is one of your pastors. And I'm delighted to be here today to share some of my story with you. Most of you know the story in the Bible about the demoniac that Jesus healed. The story is that this man who lived across the lake from where Jesus lived was living in this graveyard, caves filled with dead bodies. And he was a man who was out of his mind. He was howling at the moon at night. He had been chained up many times, but the chains wouldn't hold him, so he had chains hanging off him, and he would cut himself. And clearly the man was out of his mind. And we don't know what he had. He could have had some kind of mental health issue, or maybe even a substance abuse issue, or maybe both. But all I know is the description of his life sounds a lot like what my life had become. And so I always resonate with this story because this man needed help from God, and God gave it. And so we know the story. Jesus went and confronted the man. He cast out his demons, and the man was put into his right mind. He was made sane again. He was all normal, back to himself. And it's a beautiful story. What I love best about the story is that the man wants to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, no, I want you to go and tell everyone what God has done for you. And so this man became an evangelist. We don't know the rest of the story, but we know he went out and told it. We have no idea how many people he went on to affect. We don't know how many people he wanted to save, but I believe that a lot of lives were saved by this man's story and his testimony. And so I think that's our calling in life, is to share the ways that God has healed us and made us right. And so this is an extreme example, but we all go through this same struggle to some degree. We all need God's help somehow. And it's really my story too. I grew up in a really crazy home. My dad was military. He was under a lot of pressure, raising 8 kids and trying to make his way up through the ranks and in the military and the army. And we never knew who was coming home. My dad would either come home, Mr. Nice Guy, or he would come home and we'd get in trouble for just every little infraction. And he would treat us like soldiers. We'd get whipped with a belt, and then it went through the whole family. It was like a pecking order. All my brothers and sisters, we thought we were loving and caring and laughed a lot, but the fact is that we picked on each other. We put each other down, and if anyone did anything stupid, they were made fun of. And so I was raised in this soup of feeling like I was going to get in trouble, I was going to get a beating, or I was going to be made fun of. And so there was this sense of just survival. I didn't know any of this. I thought this was normal growing up, but it wasn't until later I looked back on my life and realized how challenging it was. Some of you have heard of the ACEs score, Adult Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACE. And it's simple 10 questions. You can Google them and take the test yourself. But if you have 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, chances are you are susceptible to substance abuse or mental illness or depression. So I took that test, and I scored 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10. And so it explains a lot about my life. But I do know that childhood experience of mine really set me up for substance abuse, because when I had the first drink of my life at age 12, I experienced something I'd never experienced before. It was a feeling that I didn't know existed. It warmed me from top to bottom, and it fixed all my problems. I didn't feel afraid. I felt like I felt like this is how we're supposed to always feel. And I never felt that before. And it fixed me. And then it was fast. So I didn't make a decision to start drinking or using drugs. I just knew that they helped me a lot. And so whenever they were around, I wanted some. And I progressively did more and spent my early adulthood using a lot of drugs and drinking, and it was just my way of life. And now I know what I was doing was medicating the hurt that I had buried deep inside. And so when I started my life over at age 27, I went through treatment. After crashing and burning and hitting bottom, I started my life over. But it's been a long, slow journey of dealing with all that childhood trauma and dealing with the pain that I was medicating all those years. And I've come to believe that people that struggle with substance abuse are medicating pain. They're not bad people. They're people that are hurting for the most part. And so after going through treatment, I went back to school. I got my degree in journalism. And throughout those years, I was thinking, I was going to 12-step meetings, and I was thinking I needed to get back to church. And I would go to church, and every time I went, I would walk away disappointed, feeling like these people don't understand me. They haven't had my life experience. I felt no connection there. And so I would walk away disappointed. That happened when I was using too. Whenever I hit bottom, I would go look for, I would think, I need help, and I know God is my help. And I'd go to church, and I wouldn't find anybody or anything there that seemed to be in a place to help me. And so I would always walk away disappointed. So then after being in recovery, I ended up going to seminary and becoming a pastor. And the reason I did was because I'd fallen into a place called Holden Village in the Cascade Mountains. It's a Lutheran retreat center. And they were doing work on the 12 steps and recovery. And I was really excited. I finally found a church that seemed to understand this problem and my life. And so I fell in love with the Lutheran Church, decided to go to seminary. And it wasn't until I got to seminary that I realized the Lutheran Church mostly doesn't deal with this. And they were just like every other church. So I was really struggling with that. And I just decided, well, I'll be a pastor over here, and I'll deal with my recovery over here, and never the two shall meet. I've tried over the years to try to do things in the church with recovery, but not much success there. The church doesn't seem real interested in this topic. About 4 years ago, we, myself and some other colleagues, pastors in recovery, said, this drug blight, this opioid overdose issue, this drug problem in our world is getting really bad, and we need to do something about it. And what we knew was that most of our colleagues knew very little about addiction and substance abuse disorders, and most churches we knew didn't deal with it very much. And so we just thought, what if the church were to get engaged and do some things? And we just really believe the church is really well positioned to help people like the demoniac who need someone to come and proclaim God's love to them. And one story I know of a woman who was in recovery, and she was church shopping, trying to find a church. And that church had a brochure in the narthex that just talked about 12 steps in recovery. And she saw that brochure, and that's all it took. She said, this is a church that understands me. And so she got involved there, and now she leads their substance abuse awareness team. And it's a great story about how if a church does even a little thing like that, they can engage people who are hurting. And now she's out there helping all kinds of people and sharing her story. It's an inspirational story. So there are lots of folks like me out there, a lot of hurting people, and especially now with this COVID pandemic, once that's finally over, we're going to have a lot of broken and hurting people, a lot of mental illness and a lot of depression. And the studies are showing it's going through the roof. And so the church really could and should be there for these folks. And my ministry, my mission in life is to help churches be prepared. And so I'm grateful for a church like Shepherd of the Lake that's willing to engage this topic and willing to think about ways that they can be there for our hurting people. So God bless you, Shepherd of the Lake, and thank you for allowing me to share my story. God's peace be with you always.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be a part of your church family this morning. And many thanks to the Reverend Karen Treat for inviting me to preach, and the Reverend Ed Treat for sharing some of his story. It is always encouraging to hear Ed's testimony, to hear the story of someone who took brokenness in his own life and has turned it into a ministry of healing and hope for others. First in parish ministry, and now in this exciting new venture, the Center of Addiction Faith, nonprofit that is helping churches and other faith communities across the country have this discussion. Not just about how we respond to the needs of our country and the needs of the world, but also how we have these conversations inside of our own communities. Make sure that we are helping those in need who are just around us or sitting right next to us here this morning. And two things that always stand out when I hear Ed's story that are heartbreaking, but also challenges to us. First was that when Ed was looking for help and tried to find it in churches, he was always disappointed. That this was not a place where he thought he could come or could find the help that he needed. And second, that when he did enter into ministry, it's taken a long time and still is a challenge to feel fully a part of the body, as if somehow the past that Ed and I share of this struggle with addiction means that we are permanently slightly less or slightly outside of the full community of the body. And that's why I'm so glad to focus in on 1 Corinthians 12 today. So I think that this gives us a challenge, not just to how we are thinking about addiction or overdoses, but also to other challenges that are so prevalent in our society today, including depression and anxiety, PTSD, and other forms of trauma, and other ways that people are hurting inside. So I'd like to turn to a few key verses, starting with verse 21. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Now, when we think of different parts of the body, we've got a lot more knowledge today, a lot more examples than we would have had in those biblical times. And that's where I'd like to dive into one organ that I know a little bit about because it factors into my own story of addiction and recovery. And that's the pancreas. I won't share my entire story, but I went in for what should have been a routine procedure. The doctor accidentally hit the pancreas with a scope, which is a big no-no. It's a highly sensitive organ. And I soon found myself in the intensive care unit in acute respiratory distress with acute necrotizing pancreatitis. Now, this pancreas, this unassuming organ, we never really think about unless something's going wrong. So if you're diabetic, you're well aware of the pancreas's ability to regulate sugar levels in your body. And in my case, this was also critical in being able to digest and eat anything at all. And when the pancreas was disrupted, it caused entire pain across my entire body. And so here we have an organ that is helpful in regulating the entire body, but is so sensitive. And it's able to do its job in part because it is so sensitive. This reminds me of a story you might have heard before about old miners. When they'd go deep down into the ground, they'd be mining for ore or coal. They'd bring with them a little canary. Because you see, as they go down into the Earth's surface, they could unintentionally release toxic gases. And the problem with some of these gases is that they couldn't taste them or smell them. And in fact, by the time they were aware the gas was present at all, it was oftentimes too late. So what the miners started to do was to actually bring down a little canary with them in a cage. And that canary down into the mine, with its highly sensitive respiratory system, served as an early warning system for the miners. So if the canary stopped singing, if the canary dropped to the bottom of its cage, if the canary wasn't doing well, the miners wouldn't stop and ask, what's wrong with the canary? What's going on? It's not carrying its weight. It's not doing its job. The miners would know that what was happening is that the environment around them had become toxic. And while they were not yet aware of the ways that the gas was hurting them, they could see that their fate would soon follow the canaries if they didn't make a change. And so when I read this passage about the body and about the way Paul is trying to flip some things on its head, right? That what we normally think of the most prestigious, the most important parts of the body, the parts that are the most obvious of what they do and how they benefit the body, but these are not actually always the most indispensable parts of the body. Because we can live without an arm or a hand or a leg or a nose or even an eye or an ear. We can't live without a pancreas. And when something is going wrong with the pancreas, it affects the entire body. The entire body is no longer able to function as it should. And if something is going wrong with the pancreas, if the pancreas begins to die, the entire body is going to die soon after. And so when we hear these stories of addiction, we hear this story from Ed, there's that two-part challenge. Will we, as a people, will we as a community, look around and when we hear that 100,000 people died from overdoses in a 12-month period in the United States, will we say that's a need we want to respond to? When we know that nearly 100,000 people on average still die every year from alcohol-related causes, will we respond to that? And still more are dying every year from complications due to smoking cigarettes. Will we say that this is a part of our ministry? That we are people who are called to healing. We are people who are called to restoration. We are people who are called to put aside our own judgmentalism and to ask what God is doing, to ask how God is moving, to ask how we can be a part of that healing, be a part of that restoration. But I think that's only the first challenge, to look outside and to say, maybe this is a part of the mission of the body. I think the second challenge, and also a little inherent danger when we talk about doing a ministry for others, is are we accidentally or incidentally creating this separation that we really shouldn't? Creating the separation of I am a part of the body that is helping those others out there that are not as strong as I am, that are not as visible as I am. I think one of the other challenges in this passage is to ask if maybe those who struggle with a substance use disorder, maybe those who are struggling right now with anxiety, maybe those who are struggling with depression, maybe those who are struggling with childhood trauma, with PTSD, maybe those who have had suicidal ideation, maybe people who are struggling in any of these ways are not folks we need to ask what is wrong with them, but maybe they are an indication of the failure of the entire body to give honor and a place and an acknowledgement to those who have special sensitivities. It was once said that it is no sign of great health to be well adjusted in a profoundly unhealthy society. So when I hear Ed's story, when I share my own story of addiction, when I hear the stories of others who are struggling in a wide variety of ways, I wonder if they might be kind of like the pancreas or that canary in the coal mine. That when we focus on and ask what's wrong with them, we're missing the broader context. We're missing the fact that we are in a toxic environment, that we might be in a toxic culture, that we might be in a toxic economy that is always telling us to do more, to consume more, that we always have to be more, that it is never enough. And that those who are struggling with alcohol or with other drugs are not the ones who they're the weakest. They're the ones who are the most sensitive. And when they are hurting, They are the early warning sign to the rest of the body that something is terribly, terribly wrong in the world around us. So friends, I'm so glad that this is a focus that your church is taking on. That this is a discussion that's happening not just outside, but here on a Sunday morning. And that this is a central conversation about what's happening in our world, but also the question of what's happening right here in our own community. And I pray that we are challenged to see the need and to respond to it, but to also look internally and to ask, for those who are struggling, what is the warning sign that we are missing? What are the ways that there is a toxic gas around all of us? That those who struggle in some very obvious ways are warning us of what is to come for the rest of the body if we don't respond to the environment that is slowly killing us all. And this, too, is the hope we see in the church. Because we gather as people who believe that it's not all on any one of our shoulders. It is not something that any one of us needs to fix all on our own. That this is not a challenge that we take up in isolation, but that we all have a role to play. That each of us has our own unique gifts, that we have our own unique sensitivities, and that sometimes we might discover that the ways we struggle, the ways that life is hard for us, are actually also an indication of a gift that we might have for others. And that when I hear Ed's story, when I share my story, I can know that I'm not just talking about what went wrong in my life. It's not a story shared in isolation. But when I can share the ways that I have been broken down, when I can share the ways that I have died to parts of myself, that I'm also sharing the beginnings of a story of new life. That in sharing the ways I've been hurt, I'm also sharing the ways that we can find healing. And when I'm sharing the ways that I've failed or fallen short, I'm also sharing the ways that we can take that next step to be better together, to build a community where everyone is meant to thrive, everyone is meant to grow, and everyone finds a place.